John. Welcome to This is Horror.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. And usually I like to talk about early life lessons, but before that, I want to know, what was your first memory?
My first memory, oh man. My first memory was actually a word. Like I remember creating a word, and I must have been, I must be just learning how to speak. I remember having my little bottle, and I knew that it was different than like the beer bottle that my dad was constantly drinking. And so I remember saying, "This isn't what I'm drinking. Is not a bottle. I'm going to call it a baba." And I remember that vividly as just a tiny little kid. But um, yeah, I would love to tell you that I've got some super dark first memory, but they're mainly fond, I would say.
Yeah, so you were creating words and, in a sense, creating stories ever since you could even open your mouth.
I did. I was kind of my parents said I was sort of a late talker, and so they were wary. They took me to the doctor. The doctor said, "Yeah, this guy's really late developing." And then all of a sudden, I started like just speaking in full sentences. So um, never turned back after that.
And I mean, so what were some of those early life lessons that you learned growing up?
Well, I came from a family. My mom was a psychologist, and my dad is an English professor. So kind of had you know perfect upbringing for the kind of stuff that I write. My dad was always pushing the movies and literature on me, and my mom was more of the psychological side. When I was young, my dad used to. I mean, this was probably when I was in fourth grade, fifth grade. He would show me all the old film noirs, Maltese Falcon and a bunch of those, and so real early on, I became a fan of like the detective movies, detective novels. But I was always most fascinated with the bad guys. Like I related to that. I thought they were more interesting. Um, and as I got older and started to become more of a reader, I became sort of fascinated with those kind of off-center protagonists, the ones that were psychotic or at least had no idea what was going on in the world, and that's kind of mostly what I've written for my adult life.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the characters that you write, they're shades of gray. You're not going to get any kind of shiny, this is the moral, upstanding citizen. And we wouldn't want it any way, any other way, really. I mean, these are the interesting characters. These are the true to life characters. We want scars, we want flaws.
Yeah, I mean it's I teach high school English and creative writing, and my students always kind of assume when you're talking about the protagonist is the good guy, and I told them no, the protagonist is your main character. Protagonist doesn't have to be good. You can have your antagonist as the good guy if you want. Um, and generally speaking, like look at Batman for example. Like the most interesting about Batman are the criminals, are the Joker and all those guys. And I sort of feel the same way in my writing. And so if you can have the focus on some of those bad guys, and not all of my protagonists are necessarily bad or evil, but they're all troubled. They're all trying to figure something out.
And so, at what point did you know that you wanted to become a writer and that you were creatively inclined?
I wrote a lot of short stories when I was a kid in elementary school, kind of focusing on those like detective type stories. And then when I got into junior high and high school, my interest shifted completely to sports and girls and friends and all that. And wasn't really interested in reading at all, which much to the chagrin of my English professor father. And it actually wasn't until I did in college, took some English classes, but it wasn't until after college I read this book called The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson, and yeah, that was like it was a 1950s pulp type novel, and at the time there was all those pulp novels coming out, and most of them they were kind of like comfort food for a lot of people. You kind of knew what you were getting with most of them, But this Jim Thompson one, I started reading it, and it's from the point of view of a sheriff, and it takes a few pages until you start realizing, wait a second, this guy's a total psychopath. And I didn't like at that point. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could make your protagonist like that. And I said, all right, that's what I want to do. And so I immediately after that wrote my first novel, and it was just a complete ripoff of The Killer Inside Me. It was like totally derivative. It wasn't very good, but it got me into that mode of realizing that I could write something, that I could create something, and um, I wrote several novels after that, which I just kind of never saw the light of day. I never felt comfortable enough showing anybody. And then eventually, I wrote a book called The Disassembled Man, which I felt good enough to start pitching around a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
when
kid.
you felt that, you when you realized that you could do that and write from that angle, and that when I discovered it, I felt liberated.
Yeah,
It's after years of trying to conform to what you're supposed to do, and then you read it's like and I hit Jim Thompson around the same time I hit Chuck Palahniuk
yeah,
and Will Christopher Bear and Craig Clevenger. That all
hmm
kind of happened for me at one time, and I really kind of gravitated to the Thompson stuff. I'm sure you felt the same way. You
Oh
had
man,
to, because
it
it's
was
just like
incredible.
bam.
I still remember going. I went to school in New York at that point when I discovered Jim Thompson, and I remember going to the library and just finding every Thompson book I could find. And I probably, over the course of a year, read 8 Jim Thompson novels. I was just like, I was smitten, and he was like, he was writing everything that I didn't know I had wanted to write. And
Hmm.
so it wasn't just The Killer Inside Me. It was, Savage Night and what population. I always forget the number on the population book.
Hmm.
1090, I think 1080, I forget. But every single book was so unapologetically brutal, and wasn't dancing around all the tough stuff that's going on. And most of them took place in small towns where you kind of have these a veneer of respectability, and then he would present all that stuff that's underneath that.
Yeah, he had this ability. It's like, and people don't realize he wrote The Getaway. you
Yeah.
know the Grifters. His books have been made, other than The Killer Inside Me. His books have been made into films, because they, even though you're following a morally corrupt character usually, or somebody who's morally bankrupt, what you find is that it's just still a classic structure. And so, yeah, you can learn a lot just by reading some choice Jim Thompson. That's like a education in a book right there.
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely my first education, and then I kind of shifted. And um, it's funny when I look at some of the earlier stuff that I wrote. It was I could tell what I was reading at that time too. So I read right around that same time something. I read Camus' The Stranger, which is completely different, but it has a murder kind of at the center of it.
Hmm.
And that struck me a lot. And then I started getting some of those Southern Gothic writers, especially Flannery O'Connor, and um, and I think as a writer, once you start, early on, since I was just imitating Jim Thompson and not doing a very good job of it, I really hadn't found my voice. But I think once you start finding several influences and you're sort of imitating all of them, and you're not doing it very well, you can kind of get your own voice that way. And so I think in some ways, those combination of voices that I was imitating not well turned into my own voice.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so you said that The Disassembled Man was the first novel that you wrote, but if my understanding is correct, Corrosion is the first one that was published. So
Yeah.
what did that journey look like?
Yeah, I had so interestingly, I had written The Disassembled Man, and I had struggled to. I mean, I didn't know anything about the industry. I didn't know anybody in the industry, and so I was just going online and like searching for small presses and sending it out and just not really having any success. And then I made the impetuous decision to start my own press. And I was thinking, all right, well, maybe if I got a few friends who have written some things that were pretty good. Maybe if I start my own press, I can do this under a pen name and it won't look like I'm self-publishing. It'll be like I'll trick people. People will never know. And so I started this little press. It was called New Pulp Press. And and then of course people started submitting. A lot of people started submitting, and like some really good, crazy stuff. And so I started publishing a bunch of really cool books. Jake Hinkson, Hell on Church Street was a book that we published, and but I put the Disassembled Man out there as well under a pen name of Nate Flexer. And when it was out there, a screenwriter had somehow found it and read it and contacted me and said he wanted to adapt it. He wanted to option it and adapt it. And so I said, sure. But again, I knew nothing about it. I knew one agent who was also a writer, a crime writer named Alan Guthrie, and he was a Scottish writer, but also an agent. And so I contacted him and said, hey, so this guy just wanted to option the Disassembled Man. Do you have any advice? And he said, yeah, my advice is you take me on as your agent. And so he became my agent. And then I wrote Corrosion, and it was published with a small horror press called Dark Fuse, which no longer exists anymore. And then after that one came out and did pretty well with Dark Fuse, they asked to publish the Disassembled Man under my own name. So Corrosion was first, but then the Disassembled Man was actually written first.
And in terms of getting contacted about making the Disassembled Man into a film, so was that Ivan Kavanagh or did that come later? Because I know that in this business, like the person who initially contacts us might not be the one who ultimately
Yeah.
makes the film.
No, the Disassembled Man has had a long and tortuous film career. So the first guy who optioned it was someone named Ethan Goldman, and he actually wrote a screenplay which I thought was really good, but nothing really came of it. And then somehow years later, when Corrosion came out, I was contacted by a different screenwriter who wanted to adapt Corrosion, and one of the directors that we went out to was Ivan Kavanagh, and he ended up not my producers ended up picking somebody else to direct Corrosion, but Ivan and I kind of became friends because we really connected with a lot of the same stuff. And then he read The Disassembled Man and decided he wanted to direct that, and it was with him for for several years, but again, just never happened. And then got picked up by another agency, and we've had several lead actors attached and different directors, and it just hasn't happened. There's the Drive-Thru Crematorium is the one that's kind of better poised right now to possibly become something, possibly become a film. But these things are so complicated. And someone, I forget who it was, but someone said in publishing, it's all about no, no, no until it's yes. And in film, it's always yes, 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 yes till it's no. And so I've had a lot of experience with that in film of being told it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and hasn't happened yet.
I found in film too that there's the Hollywood no, which is essentially like we're not going to definitively say no, we're just going to cease all contact now, which
Yeah.
is not ideal. Like I'd prefer publishing where it's like the no is a literal no, but I guess I prefer the money of Hollywood though, so it's a tricky one.
That is true. Yeah. Well, and there's people I know who have, had their projects optioned by, big corporations, and um, they kind of get upset when it gets made because then they lose that yearly option money. Some people just live off, all right, these companies are going to keep giving me that money every year and not make it. I'm totally happy with that. I'm narcissistic enough that I really want it to be made more so than just get the option money. So
Yeah, see, I thought you were going to go in a different direction there and say when it is made, it then doesn't resemble the book, which is the other problem. Like it can get twisted so much that really the only thing that it has in common is the title. But yeah, the film industry, it's a complicated beast, but we all want a piece of it nonetheless.
we do. I mean, it's I mean, when you're writing your novel, you're the lead actor, you're the director, you're all the parts, and you have complete control over it. I mean, I know there's editorial stuff that comes later with the publisher and so forth, but really you're the one doing all the creating. And then with film, it's just there's so many pieces that are going into place. You know, you obviously have all the financial interests and so much money, especially when you're talking about Hollywood. Um, and then you have all the names and the directors and the egos and everything. And like I always want, like, how is it possible that anything ever gets made? I sometimes wonder, but obviously it does. But I think, like, for me, it would be thrilling just because I think it would be cool to have a bunch of creative people kind of interpreting your work, and even if it ended up being something different, you know, hopefully it would be something good. But I think that it would be exciting.
Yeah, and it's such a shame that the Disassembled Man with Ivan Kavanagh attached has fallen through, because Ivan Kavanagh is such a good director, and I find that his movie The Canal is so
Yeah,
underrated. It's so virtually unknown, but it really affected me. It's like, holy shit, this has some of that Jim Thompson brutality and that matter of fact about it. So I feel the two of you would work really well together. So
I agree. I would love, love, love to get one of these made. And actually, he had been on board with the Drive-Thru Crematorium as well. We had written a screenplay together. Like, we really connected. We really, really want to get something together. It's just, you know, it's always the finance. It's always the financing and getting the right names attached and so forth. And um, you know, the kind of stuff that I write is a little bit different. So it's not always an easy sell. But yeah, Ivan's great, and his movie Son is fantastic. He did a western with John Cusack, which and Emil Hirsch, which was really good. Emil Hirsch was actually attached to star in the Disassembled Man, and he was really excited about it too. So I figured, man, we have a really great director, we got a great lead actor. I thought it was going to happen, but not yet. But you never know. You never know.
yeah, I've had that happen with one of my books multiple times now. And, I often say you can't celebrate any further than the stage that you're at. It's tempting to imagine it on the screen, but until you're sitting down in that cinema and you're watching it, you don't know.
Yeah, I can't get into details, but I just had a conversation with a company about one of the books, and you know, it was very exciting, and but my person representing me said, all right, so you got this 18 months now. Don't think about it for 18 months because it's just going to drive you crazy, and just assume it's not going to happen. If it does, great, but otherwise just let them do their thing, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, this is almost the paradox of the industry. As you said, like, there's a lot of yes, 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 but then when you talk to your film agent or your film manager, it's like, so how excited should I be at this point? And my manager's like, well, assume it won't happen.
Yeah,
Hang on, but we just kept saying yes, yeah, but it's the industry. It's
the
probably not
industry.
gonna happen. So assume that, then you're mentally better equipped, if
Yeah.
well, in either way, because then if it does happen, you can be euphoric, and if it doesn't, well, what did I tell you? I told you it wouldn't.
Yeah, I've got a weird combination of being kind of fatalist like that, but also being eternally optimistic that something eventually will, you know, that if I keep at it, that eventually something will happen. And I think you can kind of live with that contradiction somewhat of yeah, I live life expecting the worst, but kind of hoping for the best.
This is exactly my philosophy. And, I think there is something inherently optimistic in the act of writing, in the act of continuing to write, continuing to put these books out. And, it has to happen to someone. So there's the optimistic part that's like, why not me? And I feel every time I write a book, every time I put something out into the world, that is a ticket. That is an opportunity to maybe win, as it were.
Yeah, but I also think there's, you know, I when you start to get into that of always needing the next thing and never sort of being satisfied of what you have accomplished, that can get ugly too. And I think it's good sometimes to, like when I first started, I remember I was just thinking, if I can get this published anywhere and sell 50 copies, I'll be so happy. Like that'll be all that I ever need. And then of course you get published and you start to feel a little success and you're like, yeah, but if I could get it with this publisher and sell this many. And at some point, just being able to say, all right, this is, like I've published 10 books. I've had a couple of them in French and German, and like I feel like I've made connections with a lot of people, and even though they haven't been made into movies and they haven't hit the New York Times bestseller, it's still, sometimes it's good to kind of take a look at what you have done, and I don't know, feel satisfied.
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying, and it's something that I strive for, but it doesn't always happen because every time we achieve a goal, there's this horrible tendency to then move the goalpost so that there is no satisfaction. And I know if my 18-year-old self were to look at what I'm doing, he would be really happy.
Yeah,
But, myself now in the present in 2025, if you sell 50 copies, then you want 500. If you sell 500, you want 5,000. It keeps going up.
it's true. Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's humanity, I guess, right? That's evolution. So
But you said that the drive-through crematorium, that's the one that you've kind of got the furthest along. And that is, as I said off air, it's almost the nearest to a companion piece to the memory ward in terms of thematic concerns. And there's something kind of Franz Kafka meets David Lynch about it. And
yeah,
I
yeah. I
wonder
think
what. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
no, I think that's a good, for a drive-through crematorium. Those are probably the two influences, Kafka and
Yeah.
Lynch, and sort of meet somewhere halfway. Um, yeah, it's when I write books, I've always considered myself a genre writer, but I've never totally fit into one particular genre. Um, I've never written anything supernatural, but books like The Memory Ward and The Drive-Through Crematorium, they're just kind of they're unsettling. The horror in them is unsettling. The horror is psychological, and both of them take place in kind of either suburbia or small town America, where on the surface things seem pristine, the veneer seems pristine, but then I always think of that, David Lynch movie Blue Velvet, where in the opening scene you see the white picket fences and the green lawns and people trimming the bushes and everything looks perfect, but then you start looking underneath the grass and there's all the worms and centipedes trying to crawl their way up. And I always love that image, and that's kind of what I tried to do in both of those books.
Right, but instead of it being the grass with the drive-through crematorium, you got to look underneath the skin, and with the memory ward, you've got to look underneath the wallpaper. So,
There you go. Yeah, I didn't think about that, but it is. It's always pulling something back. And um, yeah, it was funny. For the memory ward, that was the image before I even had the story. That was the image that popped in first, is somebody peeling back wallpaper and getting a story behind the wallpaper. And then once I had that image, I'm like, all right, I gotta figure out what is behind that wallpaper.
yeah, there's something instantly recognizable about this kind of setting where you're in a small town, but you know that there's something deeply wrong and disquieting, and you can't quite put your finger on it. And I think the obvious comparison that a number of people have made is to the Stepford Wives, but it also has something a little bit Twin Peaks, a little bit Wayward Pines. There's almost something Silent Hill. It's too good to be true when you know that when you uncover the truth, you're going to wish that you hadn't. It's kind of this philosophical quandary about would you rather know the truth or would you rather just live in innocence, in bliss.
Yeah, that is kind of the ultimate question of the book. And I've always been fascinated with memory and with faulty memory. And they talk about how, like, even when we remember something, our memory changes each time you remember it. And so it's never the complete story. And then also with the memory war, just identity of what makes us a human. Is our humanity based on our memories and our past narratives, or is there something else? Is there a soul of some sort? So that's kind of a central question as well. But yeah, there is sort of, as you move forward in that book, that moral dilemma. Is it better to know, or is it better to remain in that childlike innocence, that childlike bliss? Because that's kind of fun too, waiting for Santa Claus to deliver your presents and on Christmas morning is a nice feeling. And can we just keep lying? That's why we lie to our kids as long as we can about that.
It had a very Twilight Zone feel, like the stuff that Serling would have written himself, where you have like what you're talking about when to me it felt that way because of the I guess the setting. It was this kind of where everybody's all good morning, and all of that, and it's like I immediately felt when I see those kind of scenes, I'm trained to go, okay, this isn't right anyway. There's nobody's just fucking happy.
Right.
He's delivering mail. So what the fuck's going on here? So I was already on edge, and I'm just looking for where's the world going to peel back? Well, I didn't know it was going to be like literally, but yeah, peel back the wallpaper. But it was like, this is so Twilight Zone. And it was fucking cool, man.
Well,
It
thanks.
really was. And
Yeah,
I could see
it's
the Stepford Wives, but I don't know. It didn't really look. I would put it like he basically, it was very tongue in cheek.
yeah.
And I didn't really, if I was supposed to feel that reading the memory ward, then, I felt more disturbed, unsettled than tongue in cheek.
Yeah, I think the Twilight Zone's a great one, and it's funny, when I was writing it, I wasn't thinking of the Twilight Zone, but then once I was done, I was like, yeah, it's got that vibe. Because I think I purposefully, even though it takes place in contemporary time, it has that 1950s feel, and I've always been just like totally fascinated by the 1950s because it was such a time of transition in our country after World War II, and the move to mass production and to the suburbs and those kind of neighborhoods. And then you had, like, with an advertising, and so you began to have this kind of ideal structure of what the family was and what the town was. And but the 1950s is also the time of the atomic bomb and the Cold War, and so there's all this paranoia. And so I really, really wanted the book to kind of have that sense of paranoia. And you watch those old Twilight Zone episodes, and obviously some are better than others, but all of them have like that underlying sense of dread, an underlying sense that you're being watched, and this isn't and something is different than what we're seeing here. Um, so that was what I was going for. And I was aware of Stepford Wives, but I do like that Twilight Zone comp a lot.
Yeah, I think the fact that you put the town Bethlehem, on an old nuclear test site, that of course is going to conjure up the 1950s. So there were almost moments where I had to realize this is happening in the present, but then that disconnect, that difficulty is of course so appropriate when you realize what is actually going on here, what is happening, although what is happening is a little bit ambiguous anyway. I'd say there are at least three interpretations that you could walk away with.
Yeah, yeah. There is a sense of disorientation. I think you're the protagonists are all disoriented because they're not exactly sure what's happening. And I think I wanted the reader to feel some of that disorientation. And so I think one way to do that is kind of it sort of is unclear of the time of when it is, or and the protagonists aren't completely aware. His One of the narrators' father is stuck in the past, and he's always reading this old Life magazine, this particular issue from, I think it's from the 1960s, so he's stuck there. And um and plus, I think like when you start writing books where it's completely in modern time, you get the cell phones and the internet and all that stuff, and that can take away from some of the writerly devices that I wanted to use here.
Hmm. The setting becomes a character. It's like I noticed that is the because you had to really think this is actually taking place right now,
Yeah.
but the actual setting itself has become a character. Reminded me a little bit of It Follows, because you have, gentrified Detroit. You've got 1970, early 80s cars. One of the character has a clamshell e-reader. So
Yeah.
it's like, what time am I in? And so that's very unsettling. So yeah, that's you did good with that. I'm about to take notes on that.
Oh, thank you.
Because that was actually quite brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, the setting for me is it's always like a main character, because it does deal so much with the mood that you're going to connect with, and it's the place that your protagonists live, and it's the place that they're reacting to. So my books have gone all over the place, but every one has a setting that's unsettling in different ways. Corrosion takes place in a really, really creepy mountain town with mountain shacks and all that stuff, which is more sort of traditional horror and isolation. And the Drive-Thru Crematorium takes place in a weird old amusement park town. Um, and then, I wrote a book called Factory Town, which takes place in sort of this industrial wasteland. So there's so many different settings that I've always been excited to jump into. And then but the one setting that I always had a really, really hard time making scary was like the place that I lived in, which is, I live in kind of a medium-sized town, and there's a suburban feel to it, and I always felt like it's just too boring to write about. But then you start realizing, yeah, but there's strange people living in these boring towns. And so I think we've seen some of the rise of that suburban horror, and I've really enjoyed kind of adding that as one of those settings.
Yeah, and in terms of place, I mean, I feel it can't be a coincidence that you've named the town Bethlehem
Yeah.
and it's so close to Bethlehem, of course, the
Yeah, it's kind
birthplace
of
of Jesus.
yeah. You've got the birthplace of Jesus. You've also got the insane asylum, which has a similar name to it. Um, and it's one of those names that everybody is like, I think that's a real place, but it's not really. It's just close to a lot of place names. But Bethlehem was the kind of the starting point with me, as the people who had named this town wanted it to seem like the land of promise and the land of hope and the land of salvation. And that's always when we start to believe that we've created something that's going to lead to our salvation. That's probably the surest way straight down to our damnation. So
I do not disagree with you there. Yeah, I think that's a fairly accurate statement. And I mean, with this and with probably the vast majority, if not all of your books, this obsession with memory and how much we can trust it seems to be a career concern of yours. So I'm wondering, how much can you personally trust your own memory? And do you have any things in place to help you trust it more?
man, I mean, you it's really interesting. I was in Seattle this past weekend for a book event and met up with a bunch of people from high school and from my past who lived out there. And in particular, I had this conversation with this woman, and we had shared experiences, and our memories of those experiences which I am completely sure my memory is correct on, she is completely sure that her memory is correct on. And it's not like minor, like trivial details. It's like, major pieces of the narrative. And I think that happens all the time. And it's why, eyewitnesses are so unreliable. Um, our brain's a clever thing, and it convinces us that what we are remembering is the truth. Um, and sometimes it is, and I think a whole lot of times it's not. I think we're really just always kind of trying to create that narrative that gives us some kind of a comfort, and so we choose which memories are we're going to use to fit that comfort. And then sometimes when you're more self-destructive, it's the other way around. You're picking those memories that are going to cause more pain, and focusing on those memories to cause more pain, even if you've kind of created those memories as well. So yeah, it would be nice if we could have just like if I could just watch a movie of my life and say, okay, here's what actually happened. But instead, we're just relying on these little bits and pieces of whatever our brain decides on.
Yeah. Though ironically, even the movie would be unreliable because what's off camera? What aren't we seeing here? So you're never gonna. I mean, is there ever such a thing as objective truth? I mean,
I don't.
there's a big question that we
Yeah,
probably can't. Well, you've said no, so we have answered it. No.
yeah. I don't think so. I mean, there was. I'm not going to remember the author's name, but there was an author and like started doing some of that the new wave stuff from France. Grier, I think, is his name, and he wrote a novel like where he was trying to be completely objective. So there was throughout it was just everything was just describing what it was that was being seen, and there was you never got into anybody's head. It was just completely objective. But of course, we know he's the one who's writing it. So somewhere off screen, off camera, is a narrator, and behind the narrator is an author. So and everybody has their bias, and everybody is picking what it is that what it is that they're going to write, what it is that they're going to leave out. So yeah, I'm on the side of no real objective truth.
And I mean, talking about things that can't easily be discerned, as you said, you write kind of in the cracks between genres. You can't really say, oh, John is a crime writer or a horror writer or even a bizarro writer or a thriller. Like, there's elements of all of these, and it, of course, varies a little bit from book to book. So I'm wondering how, from a practical point of view, does that inform how you go about pitching or publishing or even approaching, I suppose, the more logistical elements of selling and marketing a story?
Certainly hasn't helped, I'll tell you that. But yeah, I mean, genre is a way of organizing for readers and for publishers, of like putting things in, of having certain expectations of what it is that you're getting. Like if you're a mystery fan, you get a mystery book, you have a certain expectation of what it is that you're getting there. And um, the kind of writing that I've done, as you mentioned, like I think I started out as kind of leaning more in the crime fiction area, and I think the longer I've written, the more stuff that I read and write is kind of gone off towards horror a little bit. But yeah, like it doesn't match completely, and so it becomes a little challenging for the publishers to figure out what it is. And like so for example, Beneath Cruel Waters, my last novel, is really kind of it's dark psychological. It's almost like a family drama in a way. But there's crime and mystery and intrigue, but it was marketed as a psychological thriller, and I'm like, it's not a thriller. Like when I hear thriller, I'm thinking chases and all that, and there's definitely none of that there. So um, I've always, for better or for worse, I've just always written what I want to write at that particular moment, what I want to read. and then you kind of hope that other people want to read it as well. I think I don't know if it's a mistake, but it's been a mistake for me to try to chase a particular market to say, all right, I see that this kind of book is selling well, so let me write this kind of book. And I've had, I've had agents tell me, hey, maybe you can keep some of your darkness here, but maybe try to do it like this one and give me a book. And it just hasn't worked for me. I just kind of have my own way of going about doing it, and for better or for worse. And then you just kind of hope that, well, eventually the audience will find me.
And in terms of, that kind of classification, how has working with Blackstone been? Have they been receptive to that? Have they tried to get you to push in one direction more than the others? Do you think that you'll be continuing to work with them beyond the memory ward?
I hope so. I've loved working with Blackstone. So I've done my last two novels with them, The Memory Ward and Beneath Cruel Waters, but they also took my backlist and put it all on Audible. And they're just, yeah, I mean, they're tremendous because they're not really, they're a publisher that publishes all different types of books, from celebrity books to thrillers to sci-fi. So they're less concerned with a particular genre and more concerned with just getting books that they like out there. Great editorial staff, great design staff, just like super responsive. So I hope I work with them again. I've got a couple of books that are finished and they're on submission, but obviously, things are complicated in publishing because you have the editorial people who might want one thing, and then you have the finance people who are like, hey, but wait a second, we want to get somebody who's selling 100,000 copies, and so just have to kind of wait and see. But I've got nothing but great things to say about Blackstone. I think they're a really good publisher.
And I should ask too, how did you begin working with them? Was it a case of you pitching them or your agent, or did they come to you? How did this relationship start?
Yeah, I think the first time I ever connected with Blackstone is when I had my own publishing company, and um, I feel like they contacted me about doing it was about doing a blurb for somebody, and then after I had done the blurb for them, they had, I guess the person I blurbed had mentioned a couple of my books, and then they contacted me about getting a couple of my books for audio, and then you start to make connections within the publishing company, and yeah, and then like the woman Haley who first signed me to Blackstone is no longer there. Um, but Addie Wright is the editor that took over, and so I've kind of worked closely with her for the last couple of books.
Yeah, I've noticed Blackstone picking up some of these interesting authors that, don't neatly fit into genre boxes. I mean, Eric LaRocca is another one. And I think, like you said, because they're not kind of stamping their flag to sci fi or horror or crime, I think it's enabling them to perhaps take chances that other big presses usually wouldn't. So I think it's an exciting time. I hope there are going to be more big presses and small presses, all presses
Yeah.
taking these chances.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, it's I get it that we have to have some of to pay the bills. These publishers have to sign some authors that are kind of more sure things and are brand names and so forth. But you got to hope. Like I know it used to be that these publishers would have their those handful of authors that would kind of carry the press, and then it was almost like a public service. All right, we're going to then sign some other authors that might not sell a lot but are really really interesting. And I think unfortunately it's kind of shifted away from that, where every single author they sign, they're hoping for the bestseller. And so if you don't, whereas in the past, it was like, all right, your first book didn't sell, your second book didn't sell, but we love your stuff, so we're going to keep you on, and maybe you can build an audience and keep working with you. Now, I think a lot of times in the industry, it's all right, let's find an unknown who's got a good book and just hope somehow that it hits it big. And if it doesn't, we'll find another author and hope that she hits it big and keep going that way. And from a business standpoint, I guess it makes sense. But I think from um, artistic, creative, from the writer's standpoint and a reader's standpoint, I wish there was more like, all right, let's kind of nurture some of these careers of interesting writers.
Right, because it can take a number of books too for an author to really kind of capture the public's imagination and for then the sales to take off. And if we think about a lot of the writers, historically that have been doing interesting things, I mean, if you think of Kurt Vonnegut, for example, you can't put Vonnegut in a genre box. And in fact, his book, Breakfast of Champions, thematically, it kind of, the memory ward had something about that, just this perception as to what's real, what isn't real. Am I the only person who actually exists? And yeah, I think putting these absurd and these interesting authors, putting the spotlight on them, that's what's going to ultimately be better for, I guess, for art, ultimately.
Yeah, you'd hope. I mean, we're all realistic enough to know that we live in a capitalistic society, and that's always going to be what, at least with the big corporations, is going to be the bottom line. But and I definitely think that's where the small presses need to kind of continue pushing and making sure that, all right, we can't compete with these big presses monetarily. We can't compete with them in maybe our marketing budgets and all of that, but we can compete with them by putting out really interesting, fucked up stuff. And there's definitely some small presses who are doing that. And I just, I hope they keep doing that.
And with the ending to the memory ward, as I said before, it's ambiguous. There are multiple interpretations. I found out through watching one of your previous interviews that actually you and your editor disagreed as
Yeah.
to how it ultimately ended. So I wondered what did that conversation even look like, and did it alter anything creatively, or was this just a kind of philosophical discussion between the two of you?
Yeah, it was more like she read it and she said, "All right, I see that there's, kind of a couple different interpretations here. I thought it was this way. Am I right?" And I said, "No, you're wrong. That's not the way. That wasn't the way I saw it ending." And then she said, "Well, I'm glad." She said, "Because I prefer your vision to the one that I had." Um, and like obviously I don't want to do any spoilers here, but I feel like there's enough clues in there. There's enough. I mean, anytime you're dealing with unreliable narrators, you have to pick and choose other little clues that come from other characters and other things. And I feel like there's enough there that you should hopefully come to my interpretation, um, but I know not everybody does, and I think some people have been disappointed when they, like with the ending. Some people have thought it was one way, and they felt that was a letdown. And I'm like, no, 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 but that's not really the ending. That's not what happened. Um, but I do think there's a difference between an ambiguous ending and then just like ending on a cliffhanger. It pisses me off when you're, watching a TV series or something, and it's like it ends at a cliffhanger because, well, they got to get to season two and make you watch season two. And I didn't think I was cheating people on this. I just thought it was up for interpretation.
Yeah, I certainly didn't think you did the classic TV ending where there are no questions answered. But the more infuriating thing with the TV series is when they leave it on such a wildly ambiguous note, and then it's not renewed for the next season. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, great. We've had no resolution now, and I
Well, and you also wonder. I mean, I wonder. I would think it'd be interesting to be in some of those writing rooms. Like sometimes there's these shows that have all these super intriguing questions that come up, and they never do get answered. And you wonder, well, do you have an answer? Like, are you just kind of, because as a writer, I can put out all sorts of like intriguing, like weird stuff, if I don't have to like give you any answers to it, I can do that all night long. And I do sometimes wonder if they're just kind of doing it by the seat of their pants and saying, "Oh, hopefully they'll just keep renewing us, and we'll just keep dropping these questions in and never actually answering them."
Yeah, when we were talking on a previous podcast, it might have been Bob who brought this up, but this idea of when something has not been renewed, what would be fair or what we would like is if the studio's like, okay, we're going to give you one episode to now wrap up and to have some sort of ending to it. And linked to the other things you said about, you can come up with these weird things all night long. I believe it was an interview I was reading with some of the people involved in the television show Lost, which
Yeah.
kind of famously has an ending that a lot of people weren't that satisfied with, to put it lightly. And, they were saying that nobody knew how it was going to end. The actors certainly didn't know. I'm not sure that the creators or the writers knew. So then they just had to come up with what was pretty bizarre and not that satisfying, at least for me personally. It felt like it came a bit out of left field, whereas the really satisfying endings, as Bob definitely says, they're logical but unpredictable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there's something to be said. Like I've always, in the books that I've written, I've always had a plan before I write it. Like I certainly know what's happening at the beginning. I certainly know what's going to happen at the end. And then I have a general idea of how I'm going to get there. Um, I guess with like a TV series, you probably are starting with like, all right, I know how it's starting and how it's ending for at least a season, but I imagine most of these people aren't like able to think so far ahead of season 3, season 4, season 5. So my guess is, yeah, I think I saw something on Breaking Bad too, where it was a lot of like, all right, we're just figuring this out in this room now because we don't know where it's going. And sometimes it can work out. Sometimes like it's like taking a road trip somewhere where you just like hop in your car and say, I don't know where we're going, let's just see where we end up. And sometimes you end up somewhere really cool, but most of the time it ends up not so good. You end up lost and in a ditch with all your clothes gone. So
It's too extreme. So Breaking Bad, I believe that they had some inklings, but they got lucky being able to keep throwing monkey wrenches into the whole thing. And then you have Stranger Things, which I believe actually went in. They went in with, hey, we have a 3-year, a 4-year, and a 5-year,
yeah,
and they end up getting the 5-year, which is now spread out to 10. But 5 seasons. So, but that's your two extremes. Everything else falls in the middle. With you have shows like Archive 81 that could have definitely used another season. Uh, was the ending to the original one satisfying? Yeah, but now there's more questions.
yeah,
I think when you're writing, it's like what Brian Evanson says. I write these weird endings because I don't know and I'm trying to figure it out. So it's like, yeah, I love that. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the creators of Severance have a real plan for where everything's going. And I've loved the first 2 seasons, but you're always hoping, all right, do you have a real plan? Can we trust you? And that's part of the thing when you're reading a book, it's the trust. Like you're trusting the author that he's taking you on all these little detours and so forth and dropping these things in there. You're trusting that he or she knows where it's going. And I've read a lot of books where I'm like, yeah, that she knew exactly where it was going. And there's other times where you're like, man, um, this was they had no idea, and it didn't work there at the end. I read this book recently. It was by a Hungarian author, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce his last name. His first name is Laszlo. He's a really interesting author. He's not really crime fiction. But he's weird. Like each chapter is one sentence, and each chapter is like 5 pages. So you have like a 5-page sentence. It's kind of bizarre, but at the very end of this like 550-page novel, there's like this epilogue, and it writes down all of the little strands that he said he just kind of forgot about. And then there's this list of all of these characters and all these like plot elements that just never got solved. And it was, it was kind of funny to see it, but then you're also like, dude, come on, man, you got to have some sort of a plan for this.
Yeah, I feel that if you have awareness enough to write down all the things that you forgot about, to me, it's like, well, this isn't a publishable manuscript. This is like a draft along the way. If you forgot and you have the awareness, go back and bloody fix it. I mean, Laszlo has not made things easy for himself because, every chapter is a 5-page sentence. So,
That is true.
yeah.
Yeah, it's what we would call postmodern. So I think he'll say this is all part of my postmodern writing. So
Oh my goodness. Well, I want to know, what does your writing routine look like and how does that fit in with you teaching high school English?
I do not have a routine because I teach high school English. I am very disciplined though. So I've had, I have a family. It's gotten easier because my kids are older now. So my sons, we're about to be empty nesters soon. My daughter's in college. My son's a senior in high school. But especially when the kids were younger, it's just when you're home, there's no time. When you're at work, there's no time. But you somehow you start to realize that we do have more time than we think we do, and it's just a matter of being disciplined to use those times. So I've never been someone who's like, all right, each day from 7 to 9 o'clock I'm going to be writing, or each Saturday from 12 to 4 I'm going to be writing. I've just never been able to do that. um, but I've, when I'm teaching, if I'm all done with my planning and grading and I have a half an hour here, half an hour there, I might do some writing on weekends and the family's off doing something. I have a little bit of time, do some writing there. And then as a teacher, having the summers helps a lot, where I have those 2.5 months to um, kind of on my own. That's probably where I get the majority of my stuff done. But like I still feel like I waste a ton of time and I spend too much time scrolling on Instagram and too much time procrastinating, and I'm still able to write a novel a year. So I think we do have those hours if we're willing to use them.
And are you always working on one project at a time, so the novel for each year, or do you have multiple on the go?
I'm linear. I'm always one at a time. It's one of those things where when I'm writing a book, I don't have any other ideas really, and I'm like, there's always a little panic in me, like, what if this is the last one? What if I can't think of anything else? And then it's almost magically, like as I start finishing that book and I start getting to the last 30 pages or whatever, then kind of organically some other ideas will start popping in for the next one. It's like your brain kind of preparing for the end of one and the next one. Yeah, but generally speaking, it's been like, I mean, it takes me about 9 months to a year to write a book, um, and and then I'm on to the next one. I usually take a few weeks off to do nothing once I'm totally done, but it is one at a time. But the way publishing works, like the Memory Ward, I probably finished this book like at least 4 years ago. It just takes a while for it to go through the publishing and to have all that editorial work done, and so you're already like I have two novels done, that haven't seen the light of day yet. So it's always funny when you're talking about one book. It's like, in a way, it seems like an old book to you, even though it's new to everybody else.
So are you currently shopping those other two novels around?
Yeah, we're with my agent. We're just kind of starting that process. Obviously Blackstone's going to kind of get first look at them, but yeah, we'll kind of see what happens with them. You never know. Like, I'm not. It's always a one book at a time process for me. So and it's definitely not my favorite part of the deal is the submitting part and having people tell you no. I'm not a big fan of people saying no. So we'll hope that hopefully we'll hear a yes.
And you mentioned how you got your first agent. Have you had the same agent throughout your career?
I haven't. I've had 4 different agents. The one I'm working with now is Becky Lejeune. I live in Colorado. She's a Colorado agent. She really specializes in kind of dark horror stuff. She's wonderful. She's, super responsive. She knows her stuff. So I feel really thankful. I mean, I've enjoyed all my agents, but I feel really thankful to be working with her.
Yeah, I know who Becky is, and she seemingly in the last few years has almost picked up like a who's who of horror, just these amazing
Hmm.
cutting edge authors and people like Max Booth and Laurel Hightower and Alan Baxter. And I'm
Yeah.
not going to keep naming them, otherwise it's going to be a very uninteresting end to the podcast. But yeah, she really knows her stuff. And yeah, I didn't know that you were with Becky, but it totally makes sense because she represents a lot of authors who are doing things that are in a multitude of genres that are harder to classify in the best possible way.
Well, and what's cool is that she really loves those kind of books. So she's a reader first and foremost, and she loves horror and dark stuff, and so she's excited. Like she this, it's not like, well, I do romance, but I kind of I'll do mystery. It's like, no, this is what I love. I love horror, and so she's been, yeah, I've loved working with her, and it's cool having, I've never had an agent live close to me. I've always had, them live in New York, or my first agent lived in Scotland. But since she's close to me, we have lunch and talk shop and talk movies, so it's been good.
And so, for anyone who's listening, who's kind of on the edge about reading The Memory Ward, I mean, first of all, I'd say you fucking shouldn't be. It's an amazing book. You should read The Memory Ward. But do you have a kind of final pitch or perhaps a takeaway in terms of the type of readers that this one is for?
Well, I'll give the elevator pitch. I actually was at a little conference where I went table to table, and I had to give the same pitch to like 50 different tables. So it was like, and you start thinking, wait a second, did I just say this to you, or did I just say this 3 minutes ago? I don't know, but I do remember this pitch. Basically, at the beginning of the novel, we have this postal worker who lives this seemingly kind of idyllic life. But then he begins noticing that things are there's some problems, things that aren't quite right. He notices a young boy pointing at him accusingly. He notices people behind the windows, like with rats and whatnot and so forth. And then one night when he's had his own home, he hears a rapping on the window, and there's a woman there. And he opens the window, and she says, basically, "Don't trust anybody in the town, including your wife." And she says, "The truth is behind the wallpaper." And a couple days later, he notices the wallpaper in his room is beginning to peel, and he goes up there and he begins peeling back the wallpaper. And then you got to buy the book and read it to find out what's behind. So that's the pitch.
Yeah, an absolutely incredible book. And as I said to you off air, after reading it, I've now been systematically devouring your entire back catalogue. So I think people are really in for a treat with this one. And a strong recommendation from me. I know it's a strong recommendation from Bob too.
Definitely. Yes.
Well, I appreciate that coming from you guys. That means a lot. So thank you.
Well, where can our listeners connect with you?
I'm on social media, the usual places: Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. It's always my name, at Jon Bassoff. So I'm pretty easy to find. Or you can check out my website, which again is not very creatively titled, www.jonbassoff.com. And I love interacting, and if you read the book and want to ask me any questions, I'm always down for that.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners with?
I would just say keep challenging yourself. Keep, go out of your comfort zone. Read things that maybe you normally wouldn't read, and I think that's how you grow as a reader, and how you grow as a person, and that's really what I try to do as a reader.
All right. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.